I just spent a month making and releasing a smaller project, but I come back to my huge multi-year Goblin game and I'm finding I'm not totally in love with it. Now I should note that most of the back-end code is done. I've got a relationship system, a crafting system, a dialogue system, and so many more. It's almost all there, but I'm not loving it. So what's the issue? Am I just a little burned out, or is there something fundamentally wrong? And what's the plan moving forward? I want to start by going over what I think some of the problems are. The plan was to make a game like Stardew Valley, but with grid-based movement like Crypt of the Necrodancer. The story will involve a little goblin trying to fight off the human invaders and building up a town while they do. Now I've got a few issues with this. Number 1, the grid-based movement makes multiplayer impossible. You're forever doomed to be a lonely loser with no friends. Since all the enemies move whenever you do, both players would have to move at the exact same instant. This could be done by forcing the player to move to the beat of the music when enemies are around, but that's something I wanted to avoid. Multiplayer is part of what made Stardew so fun for me, and I don't think the grid movement is worth losing that anymore. My goal was never to make a rhythm game, and I don't think I'm comfortable with that direction. So that's issue number 1. The second one is probably the more embarrassing one. My original plan was to have the goblins be ancient descendants of the humans. They were cursed criminals and sent to the island as a punishment, like Australia. This led me to depict them in a very human-like fashion as they kept some sheds of their past. For example, here's a goblin house. It's got some moss and quirky pointy architecture, but it's otherwise a very human building. I think this was a bad choice. I want the goblins to be intellectual and not just savage monsters, but I also think I need to embrace the more goblin-y themes and vibes to help them feel like they aren't just green humans. And I don't even want to talk about some of the NPC designs, so let's just move on to the final problem. Number 3, I need to downscale a bit. I'm only one person and I can't execute my original plan in a meaningful time frame. I wanted to have a world where you have your little goblin town and the surrounding areas were full of Breath of the Wild-esque shrines that you would just have to clear out. There'd be a big boss in each region, each progressing the story. The problem is it'll take me years to create that much stuff. At this point I'm very fast at pixel art, but I absolutely underestimated how long it would take me to draw and lay out even this first dungeon, let alone 20 or 30 more. Something has to change here so it won't take me 4 years. So what's the plan? Well, bear with me here, but I've got a few changes in mind. First off, we'll have the island be generated procedurally, with some human towns, dungeons, and other points of interest scattered throughout. I'd like to think of this part as a shift more towards top-down Terraria. There will be a few floors of underground region as well, since the goblins will have to dig for some resources to help fight the humans. The challenge here will be the procedural generation, but I've done it before and I think I'm up for it. This will also get rid of pesky loading screens since it can be loaded in chunks, which I think is a big plus. I know it sounds crazy to think procedural generation will be easier than hand placing stuff, but in this case I think it will be. I actually went ahead and got all this mocked up. Here's the first attempt at creating an island using just Perlin noise values to decide what goes where. Now this is a really lame looking island. In the future I'll make them much more organic, this is just a first test. But for now, since it's generating islands successfully, I can start getting the dynamic loading to work. The idea is, every time the player moves, we look at the map and see what needs to be placed in front of us. We place those tiles and remove the back ones. This way it looks like we're walking on an eternal treadmill of stuff. But before we dive into that, I've got a word from our sponsor for today's video, Southern New Hampshire University. I went to school for electrical engineering because I thought it was the best move for me at the time, but if I could go back, I think I'd aim for a game development or a computer science degree instead. And if you're in a similar boat where you may want to look for a game development career, SNHU sounds like a pretty sweet deal. They're accredited, so your degree won't be useless, they're non-profit, so it won't cost you your entire life savings, and the degrees are online so you don't have to leave the warm comfort of your parents' basement. You also don't need to move to New Hampshire because, well, I honestly couldn't tell you where that is. They have courses covering programming, physics, graphics, and interface design, basically everything you need so you don't have to learn it all on your own, which is very exhausting. The courses are of course led by industry professionals, so you get those wonderful connections, which are probably the most important part. If this sounds interesting at all, there's a link in my description below, so feel free to take a peek. Okay, back to the dynamic loading. You can see here I've got my system that stores the tiles when you walk away and pops them in front of you when you walk towards them. If we make it full screen, you can't even tell. You may also notice that the tiles are smaller than before. Instead of 32 by 32 pixels, they're 20 by 20. This is so we could show more stuff on screen and make everything feel less gritty. This comes with some challenges though, mostly in the form of shadows. My previous shadow system used Smart Lighting 2D, which is an asset on the Unity Asset Store that lets you do 2D shadows. This is a wonderful asset and it worked before, but unfortunately it is not designed to have thousands of shadow casters on the screen at once, like I do with all these trees. I tried to use it and I literally got 0 frames per second, so I had to get my hands dirty and try to make something myself, and I'm actually very proud of what I managed to do. So one good way of making 2D shadows is to shoot rays out from a light source like so. This gives you these shapes which you use to draw shadows. The problem is, if you have thousands of trees and say 10 lights, you're suddenly making tens of thousands of shapes, causing crazy lag. I created a system that doesn't use any of these shapes at all, and does it all on the graphics card for some insane speed. There were some issues at first, but here you can see it in action. The shadows will move and flex as you walk around them, and it can support crazy numbers of trees and lights without issue. This allows us to have this cool sunlight effect as well as time passes throughout the day. I also added in a feature that will obscure things that are out of sight. It's very simple. At each spot, it determines how bright it should be based on how far it is from a light source. It then overlays a big black box. I take these boxes, blur them, and ta-da, we've got a decent fog effect. So now that I'm confident that we can make the game look just as good as it did before, I added in more important features. You may notice that the character has been moving all over, stomping on the grid that once held him captive. I got rid of the grid restriction and added in another animation so we'd have 6 directional animations instead of just 4. I then made it so you can swing your axe to chop down trees. It's missing effects and looks a little strange, but I'm going for proof of concept here. You can also destroy these mountainous regions as well with your pickaxe. I then made it so you can place stuff, since that seems pretty important. Houses will now end up looking something like this, except not with rocks. We lose our fancy fun buildings from before, but I think there's a charm to the simplicity here, and with the fact that there won't be any loading screens, I'm not super upset. It was then that we bumped into the next big problem that I wasn't sure if I could solve. I wanted to put in some NPCs, but I realized the pathfinding on these islands is gonna be nuts. The island is currently 1000 by 1000 tiles, so it's a lot of space. If an NPC were ever to try to find a path from one side of the island to another for some reason, it would take a ton of time. I mean, look at this visualization of how the most common pathfinding algorithm works. There are all these tiles it's checking. Imagine if the grid were 1000 by 1000. There would be tens of thousands of tiles being checked every time you find a path. That's when I stumbled across this old RimWorld devlog. They do something very unique. They break up the world into these square sectors, and within them have oddly shaped regions. You use a fancy hashing system so you can immediately know what's connected to what. I use this exact same system here. You can see the different regions as I hover the mouse over. I haven't quite finished the pathfinding yet, but it'll make it much faster than it was before. This comes with other perks as well. It allows us to very easily recognize if a room is valid for an NPC. It can see if the region has valid floors and walls, make sure there's a light, make sure there's a bed, and a door as well. You can see here if I click on this room that doesn't have a light, it'll tell me I need one. If I add a light, it'll get upset about this wall actually being a tree. Now all of these changes were over the course of 2 weeks. As you can see, it's moving quite quickly. Luckily, a lot of the systems transfer over, so I'm not starting completely from scratch. I imagine this will set me back a few months, but I think it'll be worth it. The shadows, room detection, and pathfinding were what I was most scared about, but now that those are done, I think it's going to be pretty easy from here on out. I'm pretty excited about this new direction, and I think it'll make for a more exciting game that has more mainstream potential. I know some of these tweaks are controversial though, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'm hoping the majority will be on my side. Luckily I didn't delete the old stuff, and we can always include the grid-based stuff as a minigame of some sort or something. If you want to stay in the loop, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you get updates. You can also wishlist the game on Steam or join the Discord to get notified when it releases. And with that, I want to thank everybody for dropping by, and I will see you all next time. Hello everyone, the time has come to shout out our eternally gracious patrons. I'd like to give a super special shout out to our Goblin Deity patrons for December of 2022, namely Zach Renes, Zach Fox, Sarah, Charles Philbig, Riley Smith, Clinton Barr, Brett Hudson, Jackson Singleton, Matthew Spencer, Jace, and Joseph Scobby. You're all amazing and I appreciate all of the support.